and thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Here's what we're looking at.
Other alternatives will now be used to replace the ones that the court incorrectly rejected.
President Donald Trump announces 15% global tariffs following his Supreme Court loss. And environmental groups sue the EPA after the agency repeals a rule supporting climate protections. First off tonight, President Donald Trump is set to give his State of the Union address in about 2.5 hours. But there'll still be some no-shows from Illinois' congressional delegation. Senator Tammy Duckworth and Representatives Delia Ramirez, Mike Quigley, Sean Casten, Jan Schakowsky, and Eric Sorensen have all said they will not be in attendance. Ramirez will join a group of Democratic lawmakers at the so-called People's State of the Union as a counterpoint to Trump's address. Congress members who are attending will, as is customary, be bringing guests. One face Chicagoans may recognize is Marimar Martinez, a U.S. citizen who was shot 5 times by a Border Patrol agent in Brighton Park. She is a guest of Congressman Chuy Garcia. To find out who else will be there, you can visit our website, WTTW.com/news. The State of the Union address is expected to begin at 8 p.m. You can watch that right here on WTTW. Chicago drivers hit with massive fines and fees for tickets could be getting some of that money back.
The ticketing data shows that poor and minority communities were disproportionately targeted with city sticker tickets during this period of time. And when that happened, with the increase in the ticket prices, it harmed a lot of people. They were not able to pay these tickets. They lost their vehicles. In some cases, they lost their jobs because they were city employees, or in cases like Mr. Garchar here, they were unable to drive for Uber and Lyft.
Last week, a Cook County court agreed that the city was violating state law by assessing fines and penalties greater than $250 for tickets like parking or an expired city sticker. Attorneys say the city began jacking up those fees back in 2012 through 2022. The total amounted to more than 1 million tickets, adding up to more than $163 million in illegal fines and penalties. Plaintiffs' attorneys say this means the city will have to refund those extra fines and fees, although no plan to issue those refunds has been made yet. Local ComEd crews are heading east to help utility workers there restore service to the hundreds of thousands who've lost power after the snowstorm that meteorologists are calling the strongest in a decade. That storm dumped more than 2 feet of snow in some parts of the Northeast and more than 3 feet in Rhode Island, surpassing snow totals from the historic blizzard of 1978. ComEd says 100 crew members and 25 support staff are headed out to help Atlantic City Electric in New Jersey with restoring service. They'll remain there as needed. Up next, how President Trump's latest tariff plan may impact prices, manufacturers, and international relations right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
President Donald Trump says the country is facing, quote, fundamental international payment problems. He made the proclamation while raising a global 15% tariff in the week of a Supreme Court ruling that struck down his previous tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, aka IEEPA, in a 6-3 vote. So, joining us now are Benjamin Krause, Executive Director of the University of Chicago's Becker-Friedman Institute for Economics, and on Zoom, Harold Krent, Professor of Law at Chicago-Kent College of Law. Welcome back. Thanks to you both for joining us. Okay, so let's start with why this is happening. In a Truth Social post, President Trump wrote, quote, I, as President of the United States of America, will be, effective immediately, raising the 10% worldwide tariff on countries, many of which have been ripping the U.S. off for decades without retribution until I came along, to the fully allowed and legally tested 15% level. Okay, Ben Krause, is there any validity to what Trump is saying about the United States being, quote, ripped off by foreign trade partners?
So unfortunately, the evidence that we've seen when we actually do the research to take a look at how the U.S. has been treated in its various relationships across the globe, what we find instead is that the U.S. is benefiting from the global trade system. We usually have trade arrangements that are two-thirds or that are better than two-thirds of other countries out there. In general, when you think about trade, you should think about negotiations with your friends and neighbors. When you share, you generally end up getting better results back from those people.
Is it possible to be ripped off? Like, is that the nature of a trade agreement, that one side is benefiting more than the other?
So you could imagine a circumstance where under coercion, someone could get the upper hand. And it's within the models that we have, we do see that there could be some potential upside of really playing hardball. However, that assumes that the other side won't reciprocate, won't retaliate. And in fact, we stand to lose a lot more if other nations start to retaliate. And we're starting to see early signs that countries are responding in kind to the new way that we're behaving on the international field.
Because something that the president has maintained throughout his second term is that we're importing more than we are exporting. Therefore, this imbalance is hurting us.
One of the things that he talked about, especially on Liberation Day, was the need to maintain a balance of trade with every single individual country. And that's just not what we see from the basic foundations of economic science. It would be as if you would want to maintain a perfect balance of trade with, say, your barber. I don't go to the barber that often, as you might imagine, but if I were to go, having a balanced trade would mean that every time I buy a service from him, he buys a service from me. And that just doesn't make any sense. What we know from economics instead is we should all lean into our comparative advantage. And when we do that, we all end up benefiting. I mentioned earlier the potential loss if other countries start retaliating against us. It could be as if each one of our households was facing something like a $1,000 to $2,000 hit on our annual income if other countries start responding in the way that we have as of late.
Harold Krent, as mentioned, the president, he's utilizing a different law this time to justify these new tariffs. The Trade Act of 1974, Section 122. First, would you explain that for us? What is that?
Sure. The Trade Act arose in a time when we were worried about the depreciation of the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar was falling as opposed to other currencies around the world. And during the Nixon administration, we've been hit by the Vietnam War. And he tried to solidify our position in part by ensuring that there were tools that the president could use in case there was a serious imbalance of funds internationally. So what the president has used is this lever that he's used just recently is not about a trade imbalance. It's about a problem of the international balance of payments. The idea that more money is going out from the United States than coming in. But there's no proof of that. And so that even though there is more of a statutory hook here for the president, the evidence that the president has mustered to date to say that there is a serious balance of international payments is simply wanting. And you have to aggregate all the payments going in and out. And the only issue that we had back in the 1974 Act was that the dollar was pegged to the gold. Now that the dollar is no longer pegged to the gold, it's really been relatively stable. And so there is no perceived needs that we could tell so far for this particular tariff. And the question is, will the court look behind the statement by the president that there is an international fund balance and to strike it down? It may be a little closer than the last one, but I think that because of the last case, the court will be skeptical and look at this more carefully than it might and go behind the declaration of findings by the president and decide that he simply there's not enough to back it up, that there is some kind of serious fund imbalance.
So it sounds then like, considering his use of IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, it sounds like you question whether this move is legally sound, invoking this particular act.
Well, it's a slightly different context. So we will demand that the court look at the presidential findings, not defer to them, and realize that in the context of his retreat from IEPA, that the president is just sort of grasping at straws. So this is set up for another kind of court challenge. It's going to take probably over a year to get back to the Supreme Court, and we're going to see economic dislocation in the meantime, not to mention the difficulty of trying to get all the refunds of billions of dollars on the tariffs that have already been collected under IEPA.
Ben Krause, how will everyday Americans be implemented by the new tariff?
So one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that we hadn't actually seen the full brunt of the costs of the previous tariff regime really reach us. What we know from research is it usually takes about a year for that to happen. The statutory rates, so the statutory rates that the president had set, they were something in the range of about 27% as of September. Now he's saying that he's going to be taking things up to 15%, as you can think of that as basically the maximum, the ceiling that he could potentially be charging. What we know is that we were only paying at about 14% by the time all of this is taking place. So there's still range for us to continue to increase. When you hear about a tariff, you should be thinking about a tax on imports. So a rough rule of thumb is that we should be expecting to pay something like 15% more for everything that we're buying anything that we're buying from any other country.
Okay. Governor J.B. Pritzker, he's demanding a $1,700 tariff refund for every Illinois family, totaling nearly $8.7 billion for the state. Here's what the governor had to say about that earlier today.
I'm hoping that the president will address refunds to people who have paid these exorbitant tariffs. Average working people are the ones who suffered under the tariffs that have now been stricken by the Supreme Court.
Harold Krent, late this afternoon, FedEx also saying that they plan on suing to get their money back as well. Are residents of the state of Illinois, they owed compensation based on this?
I mean, it's a great political move by our governor, but I wouldn't tell any of your viewers to look at their bank accounts anytime soon. It's a long shot as a legal argument, but there will be a very complicated process of, FedEx and other importers will be lining up to try to get the money back, and then they'll have to make a decision as to which companies have already passed on the tariffs to the consumers and which haven't. And so it's going to be sort of a long, drawn-out, messy process. It would be easier just to give money back to citizens of Illinois and elsewhere, but I doubt that the courts are going to go down that route.
Ben Krause, same question to you. Is it likely that anybody gets a refund?
So at the end of the day, we're social scientists. We're trying to describe what happens. In terms of trying to guess about what would play out in the future, I would certainly yield to my legal colleagues in that space.
Social scientists don't predict the future?
Well, the kind of work that we do, we usually take a look at the evidence that we have and really start thinking about what's going forward. What I would highlight for the people watching at home is that we've already been paying these taxes out of our own pockets. And we also have evidence that suggests that oftentimes we're not only paying the rate that's charged, but potentially even more. Last time I was on, I talked about how when we were looking at tariffs from the previous Trump administration, we ended up paying about $1.60 more on every bottle of $5 Chuck that we were picking up as a result of the tariffs, but the government was only collecting about $1.20 more, which is to say that even if we were to get these rebates, there's just not going to be the same amount of money out there as we've already paid in prices.
Okay, this is good to know. We're going to have to leave it there and see what happens, as usual. Thanks to you both, Harold Krent and Benjamin Krause, for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Up next, the EPA rolls back regulations on greenhouse gas emissions. A look at how some environmental groups are taking action. The EPA is set to start rolling back regulations on greenhouse gas emissions in what President Trump is calling, quote, the single largest deregulatory action in American history. This comes after the agency repealed the 2009 endangerment finding, in which the agency found greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change are a danger to public health and welfare. Now, a coalition of environmental and health groups are suing the EPA over this change. Here's the announcement from earlier this month.
Effective immediately, we are repealing the ridiculous endangerment finding and terminating all additional green emission standards imposed unnecessarily on vehicle models and engines between 2012 and 2027 and beyond. This action will save American consumers trillions of dollars and will lower the average cost of a new vehicle by close to $3,000.
Joining us to talk about this are Liz Moyer, a professor of atmospheric science at the University of Chicago, and Susan Mudd, a senior policy advocate at the Environmental Law and Policy Center. Thanks to you both for joining us. So Susan, let's start with the endangerment finding, please. Explain briefly for us what it is and how it came about.
Well, under the Clean Air Act, which has been law in this country for over 50 years, if a pollutant, any pollutant, is found to endanger public health, the EPA is bound to regulate it. Scientists such as Liz have been finding for decades that carbon and greenhouse gas emissions are harming public health.
Okay.
Therefore, the EPA back in 2009, came out with the endangerment finding. In other words, yes, science is showing that these pollutants cause public health, and therefore we're going to regulate them. So since 2009, a number of regulations that limit air pollution, such as on cars, trucks, buses, have limited the amount of some of the pollutants coming out of the tailpipes.
Okay. Liz, briefly remind us, just I think everybody knows, but how greenhouse gases, their impact on climate change, how they contribute to climate change.
So greenhouse gases are the primary factor that controls the Earth's climate and the temperature at the surface. And CO2 is really the most important greenhouse gas on the Earth. Adding more CO2 makes it harder for the surface to shed heat. And so in order to send off the heat that it gets from the sun, it has to warm up. It's just very zeroth order basic stuff. And the basic theory was laid out in 1896 by a Swedish scientist named Svante Arrhenius. And I like to tell people we've refined the predictions, but nothing has really changed in that time. So it's very standard, pretty basic planetary science.
There were initially predictions, and then obviously now we have data technology proving out those predictions that it's happening.
So the one thing that's changed since 2009 is that we are now seeing the effects. So I would say when the endangerment finding went into effect, was made in 2009, it was based on predictions of what climate change would do, but not realized. And in the 17 years since then, there's been pretty severe changes in climate that really are allowing us to test those predictions. And the answer is basically we were pretty correct. So, you know, there's nothing, if anything, the case is stronger than it would have been in 2009.
The Environmental Law and Policy Center, Susan, you all are suing the EPA over these changes. What is at stake for the environment if this rollback remains of the endangerment finding?
So what ELPC, along with 17 other health, such as the Nurses for Healthy Environment, the American Lung Association, 17 other groups are with us on this. And what we're doing is seeking a review in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the second highest court in this country, asking to review EPA's decision. And the review will involve various legal back and forths, but the idea is to say that EPA's flimsy legal argument is not a reason to roll back this finding. EPA in the summer suggested that the science wasn't any good, but they were wrong, and they realized after it was shown by others that they couldn't try to roll back based on science. Instead, they tried a legal argument, which is, oh, we don't have the authority to do this. So even though that was the Supreme Court upheld EPA's authority and obligation to do this almost 20 years ago, the EPA is now saying, oh, we really don't have the power to do this.
So you mentioned when the EPA announced its intent to repeal the finding, it relied heavily on a report from a climate working group that the administration had convened. What do we know about this working group and their findings?
It was a hand-picked, cherry-picked group of 5 known climate deniers, and they put together this group and worked in secret without the obligatory public meetings, and came up with a report for the Department of Energy saying, oh, climate science, there's really not a problem here. But that's not true, as Liz and other experts can attest.
Research data, what do we know about what they used to make this argument upon which this rollback of the endangerment finding is based?
They said, this is not a problem.
Okay.
They said it wasn't causing public health problems.
Liz, how do you think regulatory agencies should be weighing the different costs and benefits when they're setting climate policy?
Well, so one of the interesting things about the endangerment finding repeal is it's not based on a cost-benefit analysis. So they didn't say that CO2 doesn't cause climate change, and they didn't say the cost of mitigating it is too high. They just basically said it would be futile to mitigate it because the US is only a small part of the global system, and that's really the only basis. So there was no direct challenge to the endangerment finding from an economic perspective, and there wasn't a challenge from the scientific perspective. So it's a very tentative and weak argument that they ultimately put together.
How much truth to that argument is there that the U.S. is only a small player or small contributor to the problem?
Well, we are a small player, especially as other countries have become richer and use more energy. So the United States is not the dominant emitter anymore. China is the leading emitter in the world. And this is only about our transportation sector, which is about 1/3 of our emissions. So, it's true that it's a modest contribution to a global problem, but we've spent several decades building economic theories of how to assess the value of contributing extra emissions on top of a system where other people aren't doing anything. That's called the social cost of carbon. And there's arguments about exactly how that's computed, but the entire methodology for computing that was assuming that no one else is doing anything and asking, is it still cost effective for us to mitigate the extra ton? And the conclusion has been that it is.
You said this finding and this repeal mostly impacts the transportation sector, which is about 1/3 of our contributions. There's the other 2/3. Do you anticipate that the EPA will also take steps on those other contributions, factories, et cetera?
Well, we already have rolled back most of the regulations on power plant emissions, most of the plan, and some of that is through court cases Sue can talk about more than I can in 2022. So this is clearly part of a broader attack. It is an attempt to undercut the entire legal basis for regulating emissions at all, and so it's significant in that sense, more so than for the immediate actual impact of what they're doing. The practical emissions impact of what they're doing is less of the key here than the fact that it's trying to set up a legal framework to prevent the EPA from regulating emissions.
Susan, the EPA is claiming that the rollback of greenhouse gas regulations, it's going to save taxpayers over $1 trillion, as we just heard the president say in that soundbite. What is your response to that claim?
The EPA's own analysis, which came out the same night as their decision, which is called a regulatory impact analysis, completely undermines that statement. In fact, while they say, what they say they're going to save money on is reduced vehicle prices and slashed electric vehicle purchases and lowered spending on the infrastructure for electric vehicles. That's where they claim there's going to be $1.4 trillion in savings. But in fact, their own analysis shows that there will be increased fuel purchases because the cars that people will be offered to buy in the future will be less energy efficient. They're rolling back those standards. The vehicle repair and maintenance costs will go up. Insurance costs will go up. Traffic congestion will go up. Increased refueling time. And their own analysis shows that the costs of that are $1.5 trillion. So the costs to American consumers are higher than the savings that they're projecting. And that's before you even count the social and climate costs that Liz was referring to.
Okay, so we've got about a minute left, and we just talked about it a minute ago, Liz, but Susan, how does the rollback of the endangerment finding fit into this broader pattern of changes that we've seen from the EPA in the last year?
Unfortunately, this is one of many things, but a key thing that this administration is doing to undermine the safety and health of American residents. They are attacking one by one with this endangerment finding and other actions, the things that protect Americans' health. The EPA's sole job and reason for existence is to protect public health and the environment that supports public health. But they are attacking the standards that regulate water quality, air quality, and all the things that protect us all every day.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks to the both of you for joining us, sharing your information, Susan Mudd and Liz Moyer. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's our show for this Tuesday night. Stay connected with our reporters and what they're working on by following us on Instagram at WTTW Chicago, and join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm and sponsor of programming that offers continuing education to fellow legal practitioners in Illinois.